The definition of projecting: giving an outward appearance in order to avoid direct connection or to disguise, inflate the real essence, which is yourself. Not only have I and others have been bullied by mythicists, but they themselves are the definition of cult of personality. Bullying, cult of personality, taking people out of context and dishonesty, that's on the side of mythicism. I'm going to show you that right now. Let's put this thing to rest. This is the last video I will be making on the topic of Richard Carrier or mythicism. This will be the last video I do. I don't care if John makes 100 videos. I don't care if Carrier writes 100 blogs. I've said what I've said. I'm confident that my video is fine the way it is. I don't have to change anything. The responses from my video, which was very pleasant, let's just say, very pleasant. Found out that Casey and John Gleason were looking up my personal information and trying to find out where I work, you know, basically coming at me and saying, oh, you sell cheese and meat, which I did 7 years ago, by the way. Interesting. You went and found my LinkedIn account that I don't use anymore. But it's nice to know that you were Googling me and looking things up about me. It's good to know you got enemies like that, because I've never done anything like that for you. Not even thought about it. But you've done that for me. Good to know. Here are the top 10 attributes of cults. Number 1, absolute authoritarianism without accountability. 2, zero tolerance for criticism or questions. 3, lack meaningful financial disclosure regarding budget. 4, unreasonable fears about the outside world that often involve evil conspiracies and persecutions.
Duke University. We had previously discussed how bad Duke University seems to be when it comes to their bias towards Christianity.
Number 5, of the belief that former followers are always wrong for leaving, and there is never a legitimate reason for anyone else to leave. 6, abusive members. 7, records, books, articles, programs documenting the abuses of the leader of group. Number 8, followers feeling they are never able to be good enough. Number 9, a belief that the leader is right all the time. And number 10, a belief that the leader is the exclusive means of knowing truth. I would say about 7 out of these 10 apply right to the mythicism group of Richard Carrier. And while they may deny these accusations, the fact is that they do not practice it. Anything that Richard Carrier says or does, they're ready to like the post, give it an amen and hallelujah, as if they're hearing from a pastor. But seriously, he can do no wrong. In fact, here's Derek Lambert telling John just his own opinion on why he's a historicist. Notice what his reaction is.
How for our sins and the He's talking to the people in Corinth. And he says, and he was buried and that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the scriptures. And that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500, blah, 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 appeared. Most of them who are still alive, right? Those, some died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as the one untimely born, he appeared also to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unfit to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. So my question is, just to make sure we're on the same page, or at least discussing this pericope, this is Paul's talking about Christ after. This is his resurrection message. That
was he even paying attention, or was he looking on his Crestus app to find the response that Carrier already set out for him? He's not even listening. In fact, he even says it himself.
I literally don't understand why some people still hold on to the historicist position. Like, I get why New Testament scholars do, and even the somewhat critical scholars like Bart Ehrman and others of his ilk. I understand why they do, but I guess I'm failing to understand why their evidence convinces people.
And if you're starting off with that as you can't understand why people are accepting this evidence, then you're going to have a hard time even understanding what the hell's going on. John or other mythicists, just show me one passage, one text, one manuscript, one fragment. I don't even care. Show me something of Jesus being crucified in outer space and being some pre-Christian angelic being. It doesn't exist. You said it yourself for Dr. Litwa. If we don't have evidence for something, then why are we talking about it?
If there is no way that we could ever show that Paul actually met a physical Jesus, then why bring it up as evidence? Seems kind of like superfluous information at this point.
Let me take you back for 1 second, just to recap the history of how this all began. There was beef, some scholarly beef, between Dr. Litwa and Richard Carrier. And when I saw Richard Carrier on Godless Engineer's channel making extreme accusations at Dr. Litwa, who's my friend, I'm not a fan of bullies. And so I had one choice, is to stand up for my friend who otherwise wouldn't be able to stand up for himself. And throughout the years, John has sort of built himself as this historicist debunker and taking people like Dr. Bart Ehrman and Dr. Litwa out of context and trying to make it seem as if they said something that they didn't actually say and completely taking them out of context.
I can make a very, very good case for why the women would discover the tomb. I cannot make a good case for why Jesus would be said to come from Nazareth.
Wait, hold on. You can't make a solid case for why the gospel writers would have made up that Jesus came from Nazareth. All you have to do is literally read the words from the Bible. Let's go to Matthew 2:23. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. Frankly, I'm quite confused as to why anybody would trust Bart Ehrman on the historical Jesus. If he makes simple errors like this, what else is he wrong about?
If you're not educated in this subject, you would think that was a sick burn. Little does John know that Bart Ehrman was not making a point about the New Testament. He's talking about the Old Testament. There is nothing in the Old Testament that predates Christianity about the Messiah coming from Nazareth. Therefore, the gospel writers invented a prophecy to make it make sense why he's from Nazareth. You know this, but you did this on purpose to make Bart look like he doesn't know what he's talking about. So for you to use the New Testament to prove the New Testament, you're on the same page as Christians now.
The Greek word is simply ophthe, that Jesus appeared to these people, literally was seen by these people. It can also be translated simply was seen. Jesus was seen by Cephas, he was seen by Peter, he was seen by 500 brothers at the same time.
The fact that these visions or hallucinations are just claims is a widely accepted argument in the historicity of the resurrection discussion. No critical scholar accepts that these visions are evidence of a resurrected Jesus. They are just claims that he did. Dr. Litwa is allowing his religious bias to cloud his historical analysis.
Dr. Litwa was saying absolutely nothing about if this 500 people happened or not. He's talking about the text and how the Greek plays out. But John wants you to think he's an apologist, because if John makes you think he's an apologist, then you won't trust him anymore. So he's taking you out of context on purpose to make it look like he's trying to prove that 500 witnesses saw Jesus. That's not true. That's not what Litwa was saying. He was talking about the language that Paul's using. He's not making a case for it happening historically or not. But either John's too dumb to grasp that, or he's smart enough to grasp that, and he's being dishonest and wants you to think that these people don't know what they're talking about. This is Fox News style gotcha reporting, which is ironic because a week ago, John made a video about me saying that I took Dr. Carrier out of context, when all in actuality is John's video highlighted that Carrier's own Facebook post that he claims to use the word attest only happened in 1 out of the 6 videos. In fact, John even took 1 of the 6 videos out of my video. So who's the one really taking people out of context? I'm trying not to get too low, but I'm actually starting to question his intelligence. And it's either that or he's deliberately being dishonest. I'm not sure which one's which. I've been watching Richard Carrier for a few years now, even was convinced by him for a while. And I've worked with him. And I've noticed the way he deals with people who he doesn't like, who disagree with him, from actual fringe groups like Israel Only to the most prestigious academics in the field, people who are peer-reviewed by Oxford and Cambridge and Yale once a year. Everybody who disagrees with him is a crank. So if anybody needs to check their own sanity, it's the guy who says mic drop at the end of his own blogs. John Gleason, who has the channel godless engineer with almost 60,000 subscribers, has become sort of a internet face of mythicism. And that's basically where mythicism is. It's an internet thing. It's not a scholar thing. It's not an academic thing. Even most of Carrier's arguments don't even come from academia. They come from Earl Doherty, who's not even an academic. And before I discuss John from Godless Engineer, I want to address some of the comments from the video. It surprises me to know that a lot of mythicists or people who are on the fence about mythicism don't realize what mythicism really is. So we're not saying that, or I'm not saying at least, that the evidence for a historical Jesus is so overwhelming that we can say for certain he existed. We can't say that. Mythicism isn't saying that there's the reason why they think there's no historical Jesus is because there's no evidence for this guy historically, no physical evidence, no primary sources, he didn't write anything down. That's not what mythicism is saying. What mythicists are saying is that there was a pre-Christian angelic Jesus that predates Christianity, and that he started off as a complete mythological character that was crucified in the heavens under the moon. It gets real specific too. But here's the problem with that. There's no evidence of that. There's no sources. There's no texts that say this. There's no manuscripts. There's no fragments. There's no Jewish traditions that we know of. There's nothing that says anything like this. And so some of the comments on the video was like basically saying, I can't believe you're trying to say this. There's no evidence. Where's the evidence? Where's the primary sources for Jesus? Why didn't Jesus write anything down? And my response to that is, those are all great, perfect concerns. And I don't blame you for thinking like that. I think like that too. The issue is mythicists like Richard Carrier and John Gleason and others who are trying to push a narrative without any evidence, without any sources, without nothing backing it up, that there was a tradition in which Jesus was an angelic being before the Gospels. It's not true. There's no evidence for it. And next time you're in a debate or you host a mythicist on your YouTube channel or whatever it is you would do, if you see Richard Carrier, if you see one, ask them, what text do you have to prove that this is true? Otherwise, you're just making claims. And I see this double standard all the time with, if you speculate about the historical Jesus, mythicists will lose their minds. Why are we speculating over something we don't know about? Well, why do you speculate on there being this pre-existing angel? That's why I made this video. Didn't make the video to critique people who question his existence. I made the video to critique people who not only question his existence, but try to replace it with this thing that doesn't exist. This is why you have scholars like Ehrman and Litwa and others who think it's like flat earth material. And it's not because they're thinking there's so much evidence for Jesus existing. It's not what that is. It's the opposite. What people don't realize about mythicism is that mythicism is not taking an account for there being no evidence for Jesus' historical life. Mythicism goes the other direction and then creates evidence for a mythical angelic archangel named Jesus, which there's no evidence of. And the irony for somebody who wears a shirt that says citation effing needed or got evidence, you would think there would be tons of evidence and citations for this archangel named Jesus that predates Christianity. There's zero. There's not even one. There's not even anyone mentioning it. There's not even secondary sources for it. There's not even anything. It's just completely hypothetical. The whole Q debate, right? Q is hypothetical. There is no Q document. There is no sources for Q. There is no manuscripts for Q. Q is a hypothetical source drummed up by scholars, critical scholars too. I've had David Fitzgerald, who's a mythicist, try to sneak in one of my live streams with him that this is some sort of apologist thing. It's couldn't be any farther from the truth. In fact, churches and apologists don't like Q because Q is saying something completely different about the Gospels. Q is making things make more sense. The Gospels coming out of thin air, being this divinely inspired, perfect thing, is just not the case. And a lot of scholars point out the more likely it would be that this is developed over time and there was some skeleton source before that. to say that this is an apologist thing is very, very not only wrong but misleading. But it's hypothetical, and everyone admits that. But the funny part is that when we talk about Q, mythicists just go, "Oh my God, there's no evidence. There's no, it can't be real. What are you out of your mind? Are you crazy for thinking this?" But yet, at the same time, even more hypothetical is there being some pre-existing angelic Jesus who gets crucified in outer space. There's not even anything remotely suggesting this is the case. Not a source, not a mention, and it's more hypothetical than Q would be. In fact, at least with Q, you have one of the early Christians, Papias, sort of hinting at there being a source. So at least you have that. With this pre-archangel Jesus, you don't even have that at all. You have nothing. Let's get into John Gleason, godless engineer, and how much of a genius this guy. This is a genius engineer.
More bullshit from the pulpit. Meet me in the comment section and you get schooled, bitch. The godless engineer.
This is a great thinker of our time right here.
The godless engineer.
I went live on a couple of occasions. One with my friend Aaron Adair, and another with Carrier. And him and some other people, him and his wife and some other people, were in the chat just having just a great old time. Let's just say that. Having just a great, dropping $1 super chats, trying to get me to apologize to their master and savior, Richard Carrier. And I refuse to do so. They're just dropping comments and basically harassing me in the chat. And that's the behavior that I got from them. I've never done anything remotely close to that in any of his live streams. Never even, actually, I probably left one comment on his last video. That's the only comment I probably ever left on a godless engineer video in the last few months, probably. I've never met somebody more hypocritical who projects more than this person, John Gleason, in my entire life. I mean, he's the type of kid that probably used to bully people, and then when they push back, he would run and tell on them. That's the kind of person he is. I called him out for this on Twitter. His behavior in my chats, his constant posting about me, and he tries to deny it. He goes into defense mode. He says, cite the hundreds of comments. Now, anybody who's watching this right now, who was in the live with me and Carrier, or me and Aaron Adair, can now see that he is full of crap, saying, I'm lying about this. And if you were in that chat, there you go. That's what he says. He tries to deny it. I've left comment during the live streams. I've not directly commented on the videos after the live streams. I do not recall commenting on any of the videos in the comments section. Okay. What does that have to do with anything? This genius engineer, John Gleason, with the genius response, there is a difference. Live stream comments are not counted as comments directly on the video. That's how YouTube works, dude. That's how YouTube works, dude. Don't you get it? The live stream can replay the comments, but they are distinctly different. I don't see how this has any bearing to the topic of you misrepresenting me. Yeah. So we're talking about people's behaviors. We're talking about your behavior. You jumping in my live stream and dropping 100 freaking comments, you and your wife, leaving super chats to try to get me to respond and try to get a rise out of me. And your response to defend yourself against that is that it doesn't count because it's not after the video. Only comments after the videos count. So my behavior doesn't matter at all. When Derek got tired of your post on MythVision, he had to put out a comment saying, no more of this back and forth, which isn't a back and forth, because not only he was being nice to you by saying that, because I don't have a single time that I posted on MythVision anything about John Gleason. Not one time is there a post on MythVision of me saying anything about John Gleason. But you, who are posting videos about me to MythVision, couldn't get the message. This was about you. Like the genius that you are, with the self-awareness of a fly, you didn't even realize, you didn't even catch the drift that this was about you. So Derek Lammer says, good morning, everyone. From now on, I would like everyone to refrain from continuing the drama between Godless Engineer and Gnostic Informant in the group by no longer sharing any response videos to them in Myth Vision group. If the desire to do it elsewhere, it's none of my business. I'm tired of the drama between both sides. John Gleason and Neil Senlak. The genius says, I second this. This post came half an hour after you put a post out. This was about you, dude. And I second this. You don't even realize, bro, this is directed at you, dude. Name one post I put with your name on it. Name one post. Name one time I did a response video to John Gleason and Godless Engineer. Show me one video or post that I did that to you. Doesn't exist. This highlights the type of thought process behind Godless Engineer. It's not about like what the truth is or what the facts are or what reality we're in. It's about trying to argue to be right. It doesn't matter like if I'm right or wrong. It's a matter if I appear to be right. And then you'll see this in the latest video that GE put out, trying to say that I took Carrier out of context. This is just gold. And so John Gleason's awareness is going to become a theme in this video. What happens next is just hilarious. So when Richard Carrier and I went live and we were discussing the angel in Philo, who Carrier tries squirmingly to defend, that that this Philo described this angel to be called Jesus. And so we talked about this a little bit, and he accused me of having an insane reaction to one of his videos where he speaks in front of, I think it's Skepticon. He tries to say that the way I described it was wrong because his wording is not what I said it was. Then I played the clip for him, and he admitted, you're right, my bad. I did say it that way. That could be taken wrong. That's important because he not only says that in that clip, he says that in 5 other clips. And then there's a 6th clip where he doesn't even mention Philo, but he says something that's even worse. So I went along and I made a little tally of these videos, a quick little collage for Facebook. And it was supposed to be quick. It's supposed to show the slide and then show him saying those exact words. That was the whole point.
I've seen you do this several times. You've done it a few times in this video, and you did it before. You did it in your video when you showed a clip of me talking about Philo.
Yeah.
And then you talked about it. You have this tendency to change the meaning of what people say. This is the thing, is I'm very careful, usually, with my choice of words.
This is the thing, is I'm very careful, usually, with my choice of words.
When you said about Philo, you show the video clip from Philo, and people can confirm this just by watching it. Which is one of the reasons why I had a problem understanding how this could be a sane reaction to it. But where my wording is very clear, where I don't say that Philo says that the name of the person in that passage is Jesus. I say that Philo says that the person in that passage is this particular angel, and that passage says that it's Jesus.
Well, I was going to say I can pull up the clip and we can listen to it.
Yeah, like it's possible maybe my wording was wrong, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't.
I'm pretty sure you said that Jesus, the angel is actually named Jesus.
Right. Okay. Notice the missing word in that sentence that you just said.
Actually named Jesus?
No, Philo. Philo is not in that sentence.
Philo of Alexandria. So he tells us this, that there was a pre-Christian Jewish belief in a celestial being named Jesus.
Celestial being named Jesus,
Who was, and he says, these are all the attributes of this pre-Christian Jesus in outer space.
So I did actually phrase it in the way that you took it. So that's my bad.
Sure.
Because I started with just a general statement and then I went into the slide. If you look at the slide, you'll see that it doesn't state it that way. The slide is actually carefully couched.
Well, I'm glad we clarified that right here. That's good.
The slide is actually carefully couched.
The slide is actually carefully couched.
Yeah. So the slide on the screen, I think, is even more clear. So the slide on the screen, I think, is even more clear. On this.
But yes, absolutely. That was a brief, and you're right. The way I phrased it at the beginning of the sentence and that at the podium would have misled you. If people are doing that just off of a single quick brief talk, they're being irresponsible. Just off of a single quick brief talk,
Philo of Alexandria, he attests that in fact there was a pre-Christian Jewish belief in a celestial being actually named Jesus. So he tells us this, that there was a pre-Christian Jewish belief in a celestial being named Jesus. We know Philo of Alexandria tells us that there was a pre-Christian Jewish belief in a celestial being actually named Jesus. I want to make sure you understand what I just said there. That there was an actual celestial being known as Jesus, named Jesus, in Jewish theology before Christianity came along. And Philo tells us about this. I want to make sure you understand what I just said there. That there was an actual celestial being known as Jesus, named Jesus, in Jewish theology before Christianity came along. Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish theologian, he's identifying an archangel named Jesus who has all of these attributes. Paul, same time as Jesus. Philo of Alexandria is a Jewish scholar in Alexandria, Egypt. And he tells us this. If you want the sources, not the impossible faith, we'll give them to you with quotations and everything. He tells us that there was a pre-Christian Jewish belief in a celestial being actually named Jesus. Philo of Alexandria, he wrote about a particular angel in Jewish angelology, and he says that this particular angel is the same character named Jesus in this particular Old Testament passage in Zechariah that he points out. So here we have a passage in the Old Testament with a god name or an angel named Jesus, and Philo is saying that that's this particular angel. And this is what, there are some unusual yet indisputable facts that we can first cue you in on. One is that some pre-Christian Jews had already identified a character in the Old Testament named Jesus as a supreme archangel and God's firstborn son. So that belief already pre-existed Christianity. What Christianity did is they taught that their Jesus was that archangel. Okay. So that's okay. That clears that up entirely.
Carrier then makes a Facebook post saying that I took him out of context, then says, a team of liars are going around showing a clip of me deceptively edited to say the opposite of what it actually says. Remember that. Opposites of what it actually says. Think about that. Now, my video that you just watched, imagine what the opposite of that would sound like. The opposite of what that would sound like is something like, oh, Philo doesn't have an angel named Jesus. Or, I don't know, to be fair to Carrier, maybe he meant like Philo of Alexandria. He has a logos, and his concept of the logos is the Son of God, the heir of God, the high priest of God. And a lot of these traits match the Christian Jesus. And oddly enough, there is also a verse in Philo where he cites a passage from Zechariah. Now, if we go to Zechariah, the high priest in that passage, his name is Jesus. It might be possible that Philo's archangel might be called Jesus. Now, I can't prove that. Philo doesn't explicitly say that, but we can make some inferences, and, possibly that could be the case. That would be correct for Richard Carrier to say something like that. He doesn't say anything close to that. I don't care if you use the word attest. I don't care if you use the word says. I don't care if you say Philo tells us, which you do on the slide. It says Philo tells us that there's an angel actually named Jesus. And so back to John Gleason, the genius engineer in his awareness. He comes to save his daddy. He comes to save the day and make a video showing the real context, guys. He caught me, dude. John, you caught me, dude. You caught me on that. I left out a couple amazing things. And let's take a look at these amazing extra pieces that I left out of Richard Carrier's video that makes him say the exact opposite. The whole entire thing that Richard Carrier was complaining about, he says, a team of liars are going around showing a clip of me, deceptively editing to say the opposite of what actually was, including Stephen Ford and Neil Senlak. The bit that they removed is screen cap below, where not only do I say attests twice, but I even clearly and openly correct myself from saying yes, to clarify that I mean attests. So an honest audience can tell I'm not saying says, but rather attests. But that's funny he says that, because he tells me in the conversation we had,
If you look at the slide, you'll see that it doesn't state it that way. The slide is actually carefully couched.
Well, I'm glad we clarified that right here. That's good.
The slide is actually carefully couched.
That the slide was even crafted even better and even more careful. The slide says the word Philo says in the slide. Now, John did a beautiful job of highlighting that he actually does say says. So I got to thank John for that one. Let's go through John's video and the parts that I clipped out, and let's go through and see how much of a difference does it make. Because what I was doing in this Facebook post was I wasn't trying to play the whole context for everybody. I was trying to tally the times where he used this particular slide and says the same argument.
Philo of Alexandria, he wrote in the 20s to 40s AD, so roughly shortly before Paul, shortly before Christianity, or coterminous with it. He was a Jewish theologian, in fact, one of the most respected of his era. He attests in his writings that, and I cite all of the passages in my book on the historicity of Jesus, he attests that, in fact, there was a pre-Christian Jewish belief in a celestial being actually named Jesus.
I don't think John actually realizes that this first one, and the reason why I went through it so fast, is because this is the first one that we already agreed on, that Richard Carrier himself agreed he said it wrong. He tries to back himself up a little bit and say, oh, I said the word attest, which means something different. No, it doesn't. It doesn't mean anything different. Philo does not attest that the angels actually named Jesus. To say that Philo attests that, you would have to find a passage where Philo attests that. You attested that. So John thinks that by grabbing the whole clip, that somehow I left that out on purpose, even though I put it in there quickly on purpose because it was already the clip that Carrier agreed he said it wrong. So I put that as number one, because if I'm going to tally 6 videos, I'm not going to leave it out. I'm just going to put it in there for number one. You'd think someone smart would be smart enough to realize that. I guess not. Or either is smart enough to realize it and he's completely dishonest and he's trying to frame this in a theatrical way to make me look bad, which probably is the case. Now, the second one, he's right. The reference I got wrong because I originally was going to do 7 videos and I brought it down to 6. And what happened was, out of those 7 videos that I had these cut out for, those 2 got swapped for whatever reason. So I did have the wrong reference for this one, which, whatever. Yeah, I did that.
We know Philo of Alexandria tells us that there was a pre-Christian Jewish belief in a celestial being actually named Jesus. I want to make sure you understand what I just said there. That there was an actual celestial being known as Jesus, named Jesus, in Jewish theology before Christianity came along. And Philo tells us about this. What were the attributes of this Jesus who lives in outer space? He was the firstborn son of God. He was the celestial image of God. He was God's agent of creation and God's celestial high priest. Now I want to point out that every single one of these things is stated in the epistles. So our earliest evidence of Christianity identifies Jesus with the exact same unusual attributes as this pre-Christian Jesus figure that lives in outer space. So already we're looking at the origins of Christianity, the earliest documents. They're talking about the same being that Philo is talking about.
Now listen to this. Listen to what he actually says here. Does he say the word attest in this one? His big rebuttal to me was that I said the word attest and not says. In the second clip that I tallied on here, listen to what, does he say the word attest here? Let's see.
We know Philo of Alexandria tells us that there was a pre-Christian Jewish belief in a celestial being actually named Jesus. I want to make sure you understand what I just said there. That there was an actual celestial being known as Jesus, named Jesus, in Jewish theology before Christianity came along. And Philo tells us about this.
Philo of Alexandria tells us
that there was a pre-Christian Jewish belief in a celestial being actually named Jesus.
Philo of Alexandria tells us that there's a pre-Christian belief in an angel actually named Jesus. Where do you hear attest? Where do you hear anything about there They're being he doesn't actually say it, but I think that he might have thought that. You don't get anything like that. You get a complete bullshit lie.
I want to make sure you understand what I just said there.
He wants to make sure that you understand what he just said there. Clear as day. Now, John Gleason doesn't care what the facts are, just like in the case of his behavior in my chat. It's all technical for him. Technically, I took a clip out of his video. Technically, I did do that. John compares the part that I clipped out to a longer version. All he did was press pause on my video, basically, and let Carrier keep talking and say the attributes that are already on the slide. What would be the point of me continuing that clip just to say the attributes of the angel that we already established is there? It's already on the slide. Did I take any context away at all? No. The whole entire point of me taking him out of context, according to Richard Carrier, was that he said the word attest. But in these clips, he doesn't say attest. Now, I challenge you. I'm going to give you one more example of something that John thought that I clipped out that matters. It doesn't mean anything. And then I'm going to show you the part that John himself left out of the video because he does not want you to hear this.
Now, another important clue comes from Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish theologian who wrote between the 20s and 40s AD. Most of his stuff was probably written before Christianity. And he attests, he attests to the fact that there was in Jewish angelology of the time, there was a pre-Christian Jewish belief in a certain archangel, whom he describes. And he says that the man named Jesus in the book of Zechariah 6, he claims that guy is this archangel. So in fact, he's identifying an archangel named Jesus who has all of these attributes.
Did he say, is there anything in here that says, well, Philo doesn't actually say this, but there is a passage where he references in Zechariah, and the person's name in Zechariah happens to be Jesus, so maybe Philo might have thought that. He doesn't say it like that at all. He just lies to you. Now, John's going to really hone in on the attributes. I don't care about the attributes. I care about what he said about Philo and the angel. That's why these parts aren't in the video. So John's doing this like theatrics thing where, oh, look, there's more. There's more context. There is no more context. He's giving you the attributes of this angel that everybody agrees on. All critical scholars agree that Philo's archangel logos is used by Christians to demonstrate who the Son of God is. Everybody agrees with that. But here's where, and this is the funny part, Carrier says that all of his attributes are these ones. These are not all of his attributes. There are other attributes about Philo's angel that Christians don't use. Philo compares his logos to Mercury, the god who is the mouthpiece of Zeus. That's not Jesus. So there's a lot of other things that Carrier's leaving out about this archangel. He's honing in and focusing on certain attributes that match up with Paul to make it seem like Paul has the exact same being as Jesus, which is not true. The part that I purposely left out because it's on the slide, he's adding to the video as if I'm trying to hide something here. But there's nothing in here. There's no extra context from these attributes that are making my clip of Carrier the opposite of what I actually show you what he says. Is actually adding to what I said, Carrier said. It's nothing. There's nothing to say here. If you still haven't grasped what I'm trying to get at you yet, do this for me. Go to John's video. Take a piece of paper and a pen. Hit play. Watch the video. Every time that my video stops, write down the words that Carrier is saying. Write it down. And then when the video is over, look at what you have written down and see if it's the opposite of what I have in my video. In fact, what you're gonna see is it's gonna be a lot of extra information that I didn't want to use to make my video shorter. Like Philo, he's a Jew from the 1st century, lived in Alexandria. Yeah, I clipped that out. Guilty. Or it might be something that he said repeatedly. Or in the third part, you're going to get a lot of this too. The attributes. He's the firstborn son of God. He's the high priest of God. All those are the only things that I left out to keep my video under 5 minutes. It was a tally. That was the whole point. And so John with his theatrics is even worse because he leaves out the worst of them all, number 6. John's video only has 5. My video had 6. Number 6. John does not even tell you that there's a number 6 in his video. I wonder why. Let's look at the clip.
There are some unusual yet indisputable facts that we can first cue you in on. One is that some pre-Christian Jews had already identified a character in the Old Testament named Jesus as a supreme archangel and God's firstborn son. So that belief already pre-existed Christianity. What Christianity did is they taught that their Jesus was that archangel.
Now who's the one taking people out of context? John is. Think about this. Why would John leave that out, number 6? Because it goes against exactly what Richard Carrier says in his post, that I made him say the opposite. He says in this clip, it's an indisputable fact that Jews believed in a pre-Christian angel named Jesus. Indisputable fact. And here we have Richard Carrier complaining on Facebook that I was out to make him say the opposite of what he really meant. But here we have a clip where he uses the exact words, indisputable fact. And of course, John cannot put that in there because he will be going against his own boss.
Okay. So that's okay. It clears that up entirely.
Now I want to show you an example, just in case you still are like, well, you did clip something out. Maybe you should have just played the whole thing. Let me give you an example of what it really looks like when somebody takes someone out of context. So here's clip A, and this is going to look bad, but just bear with me.
Our culture is not imported from some African nation or some Asian nation. It's our English jurisprudential culture, our European culture.
Now, when you watch that clip A, you're like, what is he talking about? That is such a horrible thing to say. That's because when you play the full clip, all of a sudden there's a different meaning to it. Here's the full clip.
In the late 1300s in England, so many wives were being beaten to death by their husbands that the court of common law said, because women were considered to be a chattel, just like the horse or the cows or the animals in the field, for real. And a man was able to, quote, chastise his wife. But so many were being beaten to death that the court ruled in the late 1300s that no man could beat his wife with a rod bigger than the circumference of his thumb. We have a cultural problem.
Now that you witnessed that, there's a prime example of what happens when you take people out of context. The whole meaning changes. Now, if you just played that first clip by itself, it sounds like Joe Biden saying, our culture is so great and all these other cultures are so bad. But when you actually take what happened before he said all the culture thing, what he really was saying was that we have a culture problem, and our problems in our culture don't come from abroad. They are here. So he was actually saying the exact opposite. But did that happen for my video with Richard Carrier? Did the meaning of what his argument was change at all? No. In fact, the argument got even stronger when you play the full thing. So I have to thank John for helping me out. For John highlighted that Richard Carrier's Facebook post is completely incorrect and that everything that he argues in my clip was actually intensified, and that he doesn't just say attest. He says, tells us, indisputable, and other things. So thank you, John from Godless Engineer, for solving this for us. Now keep in mind, when Carrier and I originally talked, he admitted to me that the first speech that I showed in my video, he said it in a way that could be taken wrongly, that it was misleading. And of course he has to admit this, because no person who's sane, who's actually doing this for real, who's actually looking into these subjects for real, would ever say that Philo writes about this archangel Logos and says that his name is actually literally Jesus. You have to infer that by your own argument, by digging into some of the things that Philo says, and when he quotes a certain passage, and what does that passage say? You're the one attesting, not Philo. At that point, it's Richard Carrier who attests this. Philo doesn't attest this at all. In fact, we have hundreds and hundreds of pages of Philo. And if this was the case, that he actually thought this angel had a name of Jesus, Philo would have said it at some point. In fact, in the book called On Names, he writes about the name Jesus, meaning Yahweh's salvation. And he says it's a great name for great people. In Carrier's blog about our video, he tries to say that even I admit, or that this name Jesus that Philo says is the greatest, the highest name of all names. Philo never says that, and neither did I. So that right there in his blog, just a flat lie. And I'm starting to think that these blogs are not for academia or for anyone on the outside. This is for his followers to stay followers. He's not, he does, I don't think he cares anymore that if academia takes him seriously. He can't. There's no way. Also in this blog, he tries to argue that I changed my argument about the East and numbers thing that I had in my video, that it seemed like he couldn't understand my argument.
No, I don't understand why you brought up Numbers 23, because that contradicts Philo. Philo is saying that the Numbers passage is referring to a different being. So it can't inform the other passage.
And then I realized after reading this blog, he does understand my argument, and he's performing sort of a theatrics for his followers to turn it on its head, because he even read it himself. It says that this being from Numbers has the same name as the angel from Zechariah. Philo acknowledges that Numbers is where the actual East name comes from. He does say it's two different beings, but he says they have the same name. He says it right in the verse that Richard Carrier himself read while we were live.
Is represented as dwelling in the East, and this dawning have the same name as the former one.
And this dawning have the same name as the former one, same name as the former one.
Has nevertheless an opposite nature to it.
And at first I didn't understand, why is he so trying not to understand my argument? Even Dr. Kib Davis was like, this is one of the easiest arguments to follow. I get exactly what Neil's saying. And funny enough, people in the comments were like, well, you're not a scholar. Why would you know? Little do they know it's Kib Davis, who's a Dead Sea Scrolls scholar and studies the Hebrew Bible. But I digress. He's just writing stuff to get people to think that he's right. I stand by that 100%. He's full of shit. Because never did I ever say Neil admits Philo elsewhere test is the name above all names. I've never said that. Neither does Philo. Philo writes about the name Joshua or Jesus, but it's because it's called the book of On Names. He's writing about other names too. It's not just the book about the name Joshua. So if you put that by itself, now it looks like Philo thinks this name is above all names. But what Philo doesn't do when he talks about the name Jesus is he ever says that has anything to do with his logos. That would be the perfect time for him to actually say that, but he doesn't. So it's in fact, there's evidence against that this name of the archangel logos is Jesus. It's the opposite. He doesn't have the name. He calls him the East. And that's a prophecy that's used not only in Zechariah, but also in Numbers. Philo makes the case that the archangel in Numbers has the same name as the one from Zechariah. The name is East. It's not Jesus. And the angel that's in Zechariah is not called Jesus. The high priest is called Jesus. That's a human. So to say that this archangel is named Jesus is just completely wrong.
Today, we're going to be taking a look at M. David Litwa's hypocritical position on mythicism. As we do with all historical scholars, let's take a look at M. David Litwa's credentials. Well, it seems like he has a Master's of Theology from Duke University. We had previously discussed how bad Duke University seems to be when it comes to their bias towards Christianity. But more importantly, this is a Master's of Theology and nothing related to history. He also has a Master's of Divinity from Emory College, which is a private religious college. Definitely a biased institution, but more importantly, not a degree relevant to history. And finally, he has a Religious Studies PhD from the University of Virginia.
He also forgets to tell you that he's got probably 10 times the amount of peer-reviewed publications as Richard Carrier. He's translating Greek and Coptic text into English for universities. He's getting published through Oxford, Yale Press, Cambridge. Carrier's never done anything like that. Never got pressed at Oxford, never got pressed at Yale, never got pressed at Cambridge. You know, the journal articles are through the roof. He doesn't tell you anything like that. He doesn't tell you that he's one of the more qualified people to understand what Paul means in the Greek, in the Attic tongue or the Koine Greek language. He doesn't tell you that he's part of the Australian Journal of Jewish Studies. Areas of expertise are Greco-Roman religions, Philonic studies, Gospels and Pauline literature, editorial rows, and multiple different journals. He doesn't tell you anything like that. He just wants you to know that he's in a biased university, guys. He's in a university that's not mythicist, so they're biased. Wrap your head around this. Wrap your head around John, who doesn't even know Greek, has no credentials, some guy in his house. He's going to tell you what Paul means about certain things in Greek and tell you that the guy who's wrong is the guy who's specialized in Pauline literature, who knows Greek, decade worth of teaching. Oh, by the way, Carrier's never taught before. Just wrap your head around that. John Gleason is going to tell you what Paul means for certain parts of Paul's epistles. John knows. John's the expert. This guy's biased. He's an apologist.
But I want to be very clear that it's not that Dr. Litwa doesn't have any degrees that are relevant to the historical Jesus question. The problem that I'm pointing out here is just that he's not a historian. He's an expert in religion, specifically Christianity. When we talk about how these scholars just simply will not entertain mythicism as a hypothesis, it's because these scholars are not historians. They are trained to understand and defend their own religion. As we'll see with Dr. Litwa, he is very good at doing that.
Now, this is what I mean about John just denying reality, because he just lists off some credentials by Litwa and just laughs at it. Yeah, he went to Duke Theological Seminary. Oh, we know they're biased because they're not mythicists. Oh, he's got a PhD too. Oh, what is his PhD in? No, his PhD's in religious studies. Oh, so that means he has no expertise in religious studies, which is Paul, explaining what Paul means, what he says, certain things, might be someone from a religious department. And for someone from Duke University, they might have the expertise to read Philo and understand Philo. New Testament origins, nah, they don't know that stuff. You got to find someone with a regular generic history degree who doesn't do actual religious studies. They'll tell you what Philo means and what Paul means by certain things, and when the Ascension Isaiah was written and who by who. That's a religious text, but a historian should tell you how to deal with those texts, not a religious studies person. And notice how he says his religion. Does he realize that Litwa is not religious? I mean, you do know that, right? You either you don't know that and then you're just wrong right now, or you know that and you're lying about Dr. Litwa. I think it's the latter. And the reason why you're so mad at Dr. Litwa, you made 4 videos about Dr. Litwa, is because of what he said about the ascension of Isaiah. What's so ironic about this is mythicists like John will always claim that we should never use the Gospels to analyze Jesus because they're so late. They're so late. We can't trust them. Well, it turns out that the scholarship says that the ascension of Isaiah is written after the Gospels, probably in either the 90s or even the early 2nd century. John did a 2-hour video with Carrier blasting him for his take on the ascension of Isaiah. Litwa correctly stated that Carrier never cites Norelli. He doesn't. This is actually true. Carrier cites the book as a passing by. Norelli agrees with Litwa. Litwa was making the claim that you can use chapter 3 because chapter 3 was written before the vision. And according to Norelli, the ascension and the vision are part of a similar tradition. They were 2 separate scrolls that were kept together in a single tradition of the Isaiah pseudepigrapha. John and Carrier are mad because they got debunked by Litwa, who knows more about the ascension of Isaiah than they do. And like I said, watch my first video. Carrier makes claims about the ascension of Isaiah that are completely speculative, and Litwa goes off what the scholarship says. Now, Carrier does cite, in the loosest sense, Norelli, but he doesn't do it carefully, and he never engages with Norelli's arguments. He interacts with Knight's arguments, the Corpus Christianorum by Norelli. He cites that a few times, but he never cites Norelli for his arguments. This is a big difference. In fact, Litwa is correct for calling out Carrier for not knowing Norelli's arguments, because he doesn't. Norelli's name never appears in On Historicity of Jesus. So Carrier claims to be responding to Norelli is false. The final redaction of this appears to unite two separate texts, the martyrdom of Isaiah and the actual ascension of Isaiah, the latter being the text of which I am speaking of here, which consists of chapters 6 through 11 of the united whole. For this I have excerpted and adapted the translation provided in Willis Barnstone, the other Bible, San Francisco. For scholarly analysis, see Jonathan Knight, The Ascension of Isaiah, Sheffield Academic Press, and Disciples of the Beloved One, Christology, Social Setting of Theological Context of the Ascension of Isaiah, with additional collation, translation, and commentary in Corpus Christianorum series. So he doesn't say anything about Norelli there. He follows this by discussing Knight, not Norelli. So this is big here, because if he understood Norelli's argument, he would have noticed it already in this part. He says in the next citation, both Latin and Slavonic manuscripts not only omit the martyrdom that begins at chapter 6, but also omit 3 through 22, the whole pocket gospel. See Corpus Christianorum, replacing it with a new version, which I will discuss shortly. And what is Carrier citing this on? Just to note the existence of the pocket gospel and its textual issues. That's it. He's not engaging with Norelli at all in that passage either. The citation is not an argument, but just a citation. What does he say in the other citation? The same scriptural quotation appeared in other apocalypses as well. Not as a citation of scripture, but simply what an angel says. See Corpus Christianorum, Series Apocryphorum. Now, nothing in here has anything to do with Norelli. In context, this is about a piece of scripture that Paul quotes. Carrier notes it similarly appears here and cites the CC just as evidence. In fact, doing a word search of the PDF for Carrier's book, Norelli's name never pops up. Here's a funny thing about Carrier, though. An updated of March of this year, Carrier lists that he does not know Italian as one of his languages. How do I know that Carrier doesn't know Norelli? Because he complains about him in the same blog that criticizes Litwa. Carrier complains about Norelli. Here's what he says. Norelli advances a fanciful theory about the second author maybe being part of the same community and thus presumably replicates stories the first author was therefore aware of. But there was no evidence of that. And I don't repeat things if there's no evidence. I only work from the evidence. Yeah, you work from the evidence. And where's the evidence of this pre-existing angel named Jesus? There is none. Like most other scholars, and for all the reasons I laid out above, I do not believe the author of Ascension ever knew any of the content of the martyrdom. So there you go. Norelli does side with Dr. Litwa. Carrier just told you himself. Do you really think that Carrier would have waited for the blog to write this about Norelli when during the whole entire 2-hour video with John on Godless Engineer, he never, ever says this about Norelli? He never complains about Norelli's arguments. In fact, in the video that he did with John, he says that Norelli sides with him.
Because he hasn't read Norelli, even though he claims to, he thinks Norelli argued, because this gets said on the internet a lot and it's also false, he thinks Norelli argued that the martyrdom and the ascension are a unity, that they were all written together at the same time. That's not true, because Norelli argued that the ascension of Isaiah was a unity, meaning the pocket gospel was in the original. But he did not say that the martyrdom was a unity with it. That he actually argues the contrary. He agrees with the mainstream consensus that the martyrdom was written later by a different author in a different generation.
Now, why would he say that if he knew about this already? That's because he just found out about this and complained about it in the blog, because he just found out about it the first time. And so when we do look at what Norelli's arguments are, according to Dr. Litwa, is that the text of Isaiah, both of these texts were part of a similar tradition that would have been together. In the same way you have 1st and 2nd Kings, or Deuteronomy and Leviticus are both part of the Torah. They're separate texts, but they're together always. That's the way you would have, like Luke and Acts, for example. Luke and Acts are two different texts, both together. So the Isaiah and the Ascension were always together, and they're written in the late 1st to the mid 2nd century. Now, just think about this logically for a second, right? You wouldn't just take the book of Esther and attach it to the book of Matthew. You wouldn't just take the book of Job and then just attach it to Jonah and have the Jonah and Job tradition. You wouldn't do that. So you have to ask yourself, why did the ascension of Isaiah get combined with the martyrdom of Isaiah? Obviously, there's only one answer for that. When we look at other texts that are put together like this, which happens quite often in biblical texts, it's because they were already together to begin with. There's no example of two random texts that are floating around different areas and different generations that just randomly get put together unless they were already part of a common tradition. That's why Norelli argues this, and that's why Litwa argues this as well, based on the scholarship, once again. But just to speculate that pocket gospel written by later church, way longer, it got interpolated 1 million times, completely baseless. Nobody's saying that except for Carrier. It's because they want there to be a text that agrees with this angelic pre-Christian Jesus. It always comes back to that. Philo and the ascension of Isaiah, who they claim don't matter that much, it doesn't really weigh in. No, it matters to them because they need evidence and they don't have any. In fact, according to the pseudepigrapha scholarship, the standardized text, which Litwa also cites in the video that John and Carrier went insane over. They went insane over this video. John has 4 videos on Litwa now. He hates them because he's debunking mythicism. And in that video, he tells you that the manuscript tradition, according to the consensus of scholarship, is that the vision was last. The vision was last. The pocket gospel was probably part of the early Christian addition to the vision. So the earliest vision probably was a Jewish text. The first Greek version by the Christians had the pocket gospel because it was so late anyway. Of course they're going to add that in there. It's already a late text anyway. So there's no like, oh, they added the pocket gospel way later. That's not true. That's speculation based off no evidence. And this is what the mythicists do. They think that people who really have the credentials to talk about these texts, they just say they're biased because they don't agree with you. And John here, who is not an expert, who doesn't know any of these languages, he doesn't know Greek, but he knows what Paul meant by certain things.
The fact that Paul uses words that's more likely to indicate manufacture rather than a literal human birth. In order to refer to natural human births, Paul feels compelled to use a completely different Greek word. Now,
John will try to tell you that when Paul was talking about the birth, genomai, it really means manufactured. Now, how does John know that? Does John actually know Greek? John told me he doesn't even know the Greek alphabet. What he's doing is he's just parroting Richard Carrier, who also barely knows this language either. And so it's a sad thing to watch because Richard Carrier's book on the historicity of Jesus has been out for almost 10 years now. Where is the big shift in paradigm? Nobody's taking it seriously. And here's the big thing, and I'm going to end on this because I'm done talking about mythicism. This is the last video I'm going to do on mythicism. John and Carrier, they think that no one understands mythicism. And Richard Carrier and other mythicists are always complaining how no one's reading on historicity of Jesus. And it's just if they read on the historicity of Jesus, they would come to believe. It's like the Bible. And it's funny, you complain that people don't read your book, but then you turn around and say something like this.
Asking me why I don't read you, and I responded, why you don't read me? You don't know my work.
And I answered why I didn't read you, because so far as I know, your work doesn't say anything that isn't already in the most recent scholarly arguments.
That is most astounding. You have not read it, so you can judge it.
Can you give me an example?
A lot.
If you can give me an example, I'll read it. If you can give me an example, there's like hundreds and hundreds of books.
Did you read my work or not?
Can you just give me an example of what's in your work on this subject?
No, I'm not going to
already
read
in the
my book
other
to
scholars.
you. I'm not going to read my book to you.
No, I just want to know one
but
thing.
You said very clearly, I don't need to read your book because it repeats what other people say.
Yeah,
That's quite remarkable.
If you don't read other people's books, why should they read yours? When every time someone criticizes mythicism, they don't understand it. They got it wrong. They don't know. It's your fault. If nobody understands mythicism, whose fault is that? If it's so hard to understand that every time somebody critiques it, they just don't understand it. They're not reading the book. They're not reading the scholarship. That's your fault. Because the fact of the matter is, these real experts like Ehrman and Litwa and Robin Faith Walsh and Dr. McDonald and Kloppenborg and Burke, all these real biblical scholars who actually are qualified to discuss and relate what these texts mean and and if people are actually exist or not in these texts, you'll never get them to agree that Jesus started off as an angel. And that's why you'll never understand it. So the reason why they think that you're a mythicist because you don't think that evidence is there, and not because that's not what mythicism is. Mythicism really is that it started off as a myth and then it became euhemerized. You need to show evidence for that. You don't have evidence for that. Citation fucking needed. Can you see why people are critical of you when you get into an engagement of disagreements with somebody? You seem to be quick to question that person's mental health. Can you see that as being problematic, maybe?
I only do it when I have evidence of it.
I only do it when I have evidence of it.
Instead of saying, yeah, my bad, maybe I went too far with it. The dozens of people, including Ehrman, myself, other people as well, probably at least a dozen right now, Tim O'Neill, Hansen, Stephen Ford, all of them are mentally ill and crazy and cranks. Charlesworth is a crank. Lit was a crank. Lit was a crypto Christian as well. They're all secret believers. You're so qualified for that, right? You have the evidence. This just highlights who this person is. I mean, it's incredible that this movement, it shouldn't be a shocker or a coincidence that the two big pillars of mythicism, on one hand, you got Robert M. Price, who thinks that Black Lives Matter rioters and protesters should be shot and killed. On the other hand, you have this weird guy who calls everybody cranks and, is getting accused by multiple women of sexual harassment. Yeah, this probably is a bad movement right here. The only person I've ever met who is psychopathic enough to put "mic dropped" at the end of their own blog is Richard Carrier, the same guy who always has to put PhD next to his name, who can't go on a fucking live stream with somebody without putting PhD next to his name and telling you 100,000 times in a year that he's got peer-reviewed material. Do you guys even know that Litwa and Ehrman and all these guys have like 400 peer-reviewed articles and books compared to the 5 or 6 that Carrier has? Just keep that in mind and just remember that. These people don't need to put PhD next to their name. They don't have to remind you how many peer-reviewed material they have. They don't put mic drop after their arguments, especially when they're bad like this one.
If Jesus is the higher power, it gives them this sort of, again, moral scaffolding to live their life.
Yes. Well, Jesus would probably on the whole provide a fairly good moral scaffolding. Not totally, but
right.
He was ahead of his time anyway.
So you do think he was a real person?
Most of the scholars I've talked to say he probably was. The evidence is not great, of course, but I think I don't think it's that big a deal, actually, because a wandering preacher called Yeshua or Yehoshua would not be surprising. I mean, it's a common name,
right?
And there are plenty of wandering preachers.
If you could just give us just a little summary on your take on the mythicist position and whether you think it's plausible or not and why.
So the mythicist position being Jesus never existed.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think he existed.
I think the mythicist position is intellectually bankrupt.
Ooh.
And it's almost a waste of time to talk about it, Neil.
What are your thoughts on mythicism?
My view of it is that mythicists shoot themselves in the foot. I don't think it's responsible history. And I'm not a Christian myself, but I don't think that the way to deal with the problems of Christianity is to take a stand that most people are just going to laugh at.
What are a few reasons you think a historical Jesus exists over the mythicist model?
I'm kind of radical in a lot of ways, but I'm not that radical. there was probably a guy, or maybe a series of guys or leaders, but one of them was executed, and it was devastating. I don't think he resurrected from the dead, but it's more probable than improbable that some guy existed and was executed.
I have atheist professors, I have Jewish professors, I have Muslim professors and Christian professors. The universities are not filled with apologists, are not filled with systematic theologians, and you cannot walk into a university currently and find any professor of New Testament or ancient history who does not believe in the historical Jesus. Let's start with the letters of Paul, which are written by a Pharisaic Jew who never met Jesus, never claims to have met Jesus. But he's also not arguing that Jesus existed. He's not arguing with people who don't think Jesus existed. That's not the conversation that's happening. He is actually confronting other Christians who are citing the teachings of Jesus against him. Look at Paul on marriage in 1 Corinthians. Look at Paul on whether or not teachers deserve to be paid for their work. And these are places where Paul cites the teachings of Jesus and says, I know Jesus taught that, but I have reasons to do other things in these cases.
So I think it's a relatively short period of time between the writings of, say, Paul, which are like mid-50s, and the likely execution that occurred.
And the mythicists often like to say that, okay, well, the Gospels are long after Paul, and they bring up so many things that Paul doesn't bring up.
I mean, Paul is not ignorant about the historical Jesus. I don't know how anybody could say that. He quotes him several times, and he refers to he talks about his crucifixion all the time.
I don't think Paul was readily accepted by his own testimony by those in Jerusalem, Peter and James, he names specifically. And I don't see much of a benefit to Paul, assuming that that's genuine to Paul, those claims, making that up, because it establishes his justification for being what he calls the apostle to the Gentiles. So something was happening in Jerusalem in the wake of this man we call Jesus.
Mythicists often look at the Pauline epistles and they'll say, oh, Jesus was crucified by the rulers of the age, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, or in 2nd Corinthians it talks about, okay, Satan's involved now. And they'll say, well, that's evidence that Jesus was crucified by heavenly powers, not human beings.
They don't only say that, they say that he was crucified in heaven.
Satan and his demons lived up there, and they had castles and gardens and all kinds of things up in the sky, thousands of miles away. And that was actually the usual location of Satan and his demons. And so the theory is that Jesus came down to that level, convinced the demons and stuff that he was a man, like a sorcerer or something had flown up there or whatever. And so they kill him, mockingly or whatever, not realizing that this is going to realize Jesus' mission and allow him to defeat them and overcome their power over death and so on.
Paul was an apocalypticist. Paul believed that the powers of evil were affecting people here on earth, and that they were forcing people to do bad things. When Paul talks about the rulers, sometimes he actually means the rulers. He means like, the Roman authorities, and he means like the Jewish leaders. But if these rulers are acting in evil ways, it's because Satan is among them, making them do it, and the other evil forces. Paul talks about this kind of thing all the time. He talks about, in Corinthians, he talks about Satan deceiving people because he comes as an angel of light. It doesn't mean these people are being deceived in heaven. They're deceived here on earth, because this is where Satan is. Paul does not think that Satan is in heaven. Early Jewish apocalypticists thought that Satan had been cast out of heaven with the demons and they were here on earth. They are not active in heaven. They're not crucifying people up in heaven. Study all of Paul and you'll see what it means. And so it absolutely does not mean that Jesus got crucified in heaven by, the devil's henchmen or something.
The first is, of course, the Pauline statements and his appeal to tradition about the Eucharist and Jesus' death and resurrection and so on. It's already been mythologized, of course, but obviously there's at a very early stage an explosion of interest in Jesus The next most important evidence for this comes from Josephus.
It's the passage in Antiquities 18 where Josephus is describing Pontius Pilate's tenure as a low-level governor, equestrian governor of Judea. And then he says, about this time, there was a guy, a man, if one should call him really a man, who, did these amazing things. And then he talks about his arrest, his crucifixion, and then the belief of his followers that he was raised from the dead. The discussion for centuries has been about whether Josephus could have written that. The vast majority of scholars today hold that most of it or much of it is actually from Josephus, but some phrases in it may have come in by Christian copyists, and the most obvious case is he was the Christ. And there are various reasons for that. For example, how much of this language is typical of Josephus and how much is odd in terms of how he uses language. And a number of his phrases in that passage turn out to be very typical of him, but not in an obvious way. So 2 or 3 of them are only typical of that section of the Antiquities, which is an unusual section in style. So that's quite interesting, because if you said, it was a forger, a Christian, copyist who just stuck the whole passage in, well, he didn't do it in a very simple way. He would have had to do almost miraculous levels of research in ancient terms, because they didn't have the tools we have, the digital tools to search phrasing and things like that. Another consideration is that in Antiquities 20, there's a passage that refers to Jesus' brother, James. There are scholars who dispute its authenticity, but not nearly so many at all, because it looks like it fits quite well in Josephus's whole way of narrating. And James, the brother of Jesus, is quite incidental also. His name is incidental to that passage. Moreover, he's introduced in a very casual way as just one of a bunch of people whom a certain high priest decided to execute while the governor was away. So if that passage is authentic, and it begins by saying one of the guys that he executed was the brother of the one known as Christ, it suggests that he'd already referred to a Jesus known as Christ.
You mentioned the note by Josephus about Jesus's brother James and 10 others who were executed for violating Torah. I think that is historically reliable, and attempts to sidestep it, I think, are simply special pleading in order to sustain the conspiracy theory we call mythicism. Now, of course, the story of Jesus became mythologized. No serious historian is going to think that Jesus walked on water or spoke to the dead or even rose from the dead.
And so I think that is an indication that there are too many arguments to say that there was a man named Jesus. Do I think he looks like the gentleman that we have presented to us in the Gospels? No, I do not. Yeah, but I do think he...
We know there are lots of these kinds of figures wandering around. Honi, the circle drawer, is one of my favorites. He had his methods, basically drawing circles and standing in them. But, the kind of John the Baptist Jesus thing, that looks to me like a massive kind of polemic as a way of trying to say, what's the relationship between these two figures? John the Baptist had his head cut off. This Jesus guy, was crucified. So you've got two kind of executed figures who have been brought together. That to me suggests that there's somebody is trying to reconcile these two popular kind of cult leaders.
We know that Judaism is a hybrid phenomenon in the first century that had enormous energy. And behind that energy is a character that we now know as Jesus of Nazareth. And it's very hard to explain that explosion in going in two directions, one in a Jewish direction and the other Greco-Roman direction, unless you have a character whose memory was so fantastic and sensational that people tried to attach their own ideologies to it.
Again, let me emphasize, I'm trying to approach this as a historian. I do get exasperated with mythicists because mythicists and I agree on a lot of things with a lot of things, actually, about religion and about the damage that it can do. But arguing that Jesus himself is a myth is just shooting yourself in the foot because it's just not credible historically. And so there are better strategies, in my opinion. Every time I say this, people get all upset with me, and I get it. And they think I'm being an elitist, and I'm just, I think that there are better ways to do I think there are better ways to do it. And I don't think it's responsible history myself.